So, as you can see, as you've been told, I'm Duncan Garrow. I thought I'd bring Fraser virtually here, because Fraser is very much part of this project as well. I've been working with Fraser for a long time now. He's not looking quite so sprightly these days. He's got a young baby and he's just moved house, which is why he can be here today. But just to make the point that this is a project that's very much one I've been doing with Fraser. It just happens to be me that's there tonight. So, I thought I'd begin with a simple question, in some ways a simple question. What is a crannog? And that lovely image of Loch Tay kind of conjures up the sort of stereotypical or classic, I guess, image of a Scottish crannog, a dwelling out there on stilts in the lake or loch. In more prosaic terms, I've taken you to the Canmore definition of a crannog, which is an island, partly or wholly artificial, often formed by dumping timber, earth and stones and revetted with timber piles or a palisade. Built in a loch, wetland or estuary and dating from prehistory to medieval. So a fairly vague description in some ways, but nonetheless capturing quite an enigmatic and evocative kind of site. I just put a couple of nice drawings from Munro's 1882 classic work, Ancient Scottish Lake Dwellings. There you can see a copy and a beautiful illustration showing the Loch of the Clans, which is identified as far back as 1863. Just really to make the point that explorations of crannogs or island dwellings have been part of archaeology since its very early inception, basically. And you can see from this another beautiful illustration from that same book of a different crannog, but you can see the incredible preservation of timbers there, because quite often these sites are waterlogged, and that leads to amazing preservation of the timber elements of those sites. And that again was recognised a long way back, as you can see, and has been something that has pervaded crannog studies ever since. So this is a map of islet settlements, as Graham Cave has called it, from Graham Cave's excellent 2010 BAR that really covers a lot of this work in substantial detail. And as Graham makes clear, over 400 are recorded from Scotland, including to 150, around 150. That's one of the questions that we all need to answer in the Outer Hebrides. You can see that very distinctly, and that especially in the southern islands, that really dense agglomeration of islet sites, which incorporates more than just crannogs, but we'll come on to definitions in a minute. There, another illustration taken from Cavis's work, just to broadly make the point. This is him looking just at crannogs, which is why you haven't got so many dots, things defined as crannogs, I should say. But it's just to make the point that, as you might expect, architecture varies according to where you are and the geology that you're on. So out in the Outer Hebrides, and as you move north, there's many more made out of stone, whereas as you move further south to less stony areas, as you might imagine, they're more commonly made out of timber or brushwood and peat. In terms of our sites, that's one of them. I'll give you a bit more of a view in a minute. Another issue, which I've slightly touched on already, is the fact that, as Ian Armitt makes clear in that quote below, there's been problems of definition, which has kind of prevented clear-cut study of these sites that many people since, especially Ian Armitt's work in the 90s, and ever since then, people have raised as an issue, but it hasn't yet been resolved. So the point that Ian's making there is the fact that in the Outer Hebrides, often these sites were called island duns, or dunes, rather than crannogs, but not really for any particular reason. So as a result of that, study of these sites has slightly been split, and especially since Armitt's work in the 90s, people have been making that point, saying we need to bring them back together somehow. So in a sense, crannog is the most evocative term, which is why I've used it, but probably some of our sites would have been called island dunes, but not for any particular reason, if you see what I mean. So, just in terms of the dating of crannogs, and perhaps the vaguest bit of that Canmore definition was their dating, as you can see, dating from prehistory to medieval. In that bar chart there, you can see I've translated some of the data out of Graham Cavis's work to produce that bar chart, which shows you a breakdown of the dates, rough date ranges, so obviously moving from later prehistory into the early medieval and later periods. And you can see that it's true, that statement isn't just vagueness, it's vagueness for a reason, that there are sites that date to all of these different periods that can be called crannogs. The interesting thing in some ways is the fact that, as you can see on the left there, the earlier you go, the more they're dated by radiocarbon, and the later you go, the light blue, they're dated by other means, which is basically by material culture. So there's the way in which their signatures are being understood is different for those different periods. And of course, as you might imagine, all of those, the counts there on the left, might be multiple as well. So often later prehistoric crannogs get reoccupied or have continuous occupation through into the medieval period and later. So it's a complicated picture in which sites can be multi-period as well as the site type in itself being multi-period as well. It was really work in the 1990s, reflecting on that bar chart on the left there, and I'm sorry, I should have said, you see that little tiny blip on the left? We'll come to that one in a minute. But on the left there, you can see the dark blue being very high, so as a result, that's reflected in the fact that really widespread radiocarbon dating took place in relation to these sites in the 80s and 90s. And Anne Crone and John Henderson produced some two key papers looking at the radiocarbon dating of these sites. And really, it was at that point, interestingly, that people actually properly took on board that lots of them were later prehistoric. Because before, primarily, they'd been associated with medieval material culture, as we saw with the light blue bits of the bar charts. And it was only until radiocarbon dating picked up that later prehistoric element that people pushed the majority of dates, or a widespread understanding of the potential earliness of dates back in time. So nonetheless, and that vagueness has been maintained. And you can see from that quote that from the earliest construction origins of crannogs in the late Bronze Age through to their apparent emergence to state in the early historic period after the mid-1st millennium AD. So still, we're maintaining this, that's extended that time frame from the late Bronze Age right through to the medieval, and it's something that people have to incorporate into their account. And in his book, Cave makes a really interesting point that has always resonated with me in terms of our understanding of these sites, is that arguably that vagueness of their dating, the fact you can't straightforwardly assign them to a period, has led to a tendency for them to be omitted from period-specific narratives. So perhaps, say, people studying the Iron Age, the crannogs that they're talking about, they don't know whether they're Iron Age or not. They might be early medieval unless they've been excavated, and vice versa. So early medieval ones may be earlier than that. So because of that temporal complexity and confusion, in a way I think people have sometimes perhaps tended to sideline these kinds of sites in the period-specific narratives. Another issue, as well as that arguable sidelining, is a lack of research, which always suits me and Fraser, because we can just quote lots of people saying crannogs haven't been researched enough, and that justifies what we're doing from the very start, as long as you believe these people. But as you can see, don't worry about every single word of that. It's just a point that lots of different people over the years have said. So Henderson's, for example, the third one down, as we've seen, there's over 400 sites. Henderson in 1998 says there's only been 5 excavations carried out to modern standards, and that hasn't vastly changed in the succeeding 19 years since then. So there has been arguably that this is a category of site that's been under-researched, except in very small areas when they're like Loctay, that they've been extremely well researched. So it's a complicated picture. So that's all very well, but what about the possibility of early cranogs, and that blip that I mentioned on the left-hand side of that graph? So Island Donald in North Uist, a lovely photo from Beveridge taken around 1900, is the main site that we need to focus on. It's situated on the north coast of North Uist up there, so obviously in the same part of the world as Lewis that we're going to be talking about shortly. And interestingly, when Beveridge photographed it and when Ian Armitt went to excavate the site, everyone assumed it was going to be Iron Age, and Ian went there because he was interested in the relationship between what he thought was an Iron Age cranog and another Iron Age settlement that was not on a little islet on the shore of the same loch, Loch Olivat. So that was the reason why he went to dig that site. However, pretty much straight away, as soon as they put a shovel in the ground and done a bit of digging, loads of Neolithic pottery emerged. And Ian, being a sensible man, realised it was Neolithic. And because it was Neolithic, to their credit, and to my happiness, they thought, that's interesting, we'll keep digging. Even though their research questions had really been driven by the Iron Age, suddenly there was a whole new set of research questions that were about, oh, there's a Neolithic cranog, that's very bizarre. The site isn't fully published yet. That Alan Braby reconstruction is from a 2003 paper that Ian produced. I understand that the site is coming very close to completion, not least because Mike Copper, who took those beautiful photos at the bottom there, has written for his PhD, written up the pottery assemblage of that site, as well as some pottery assemblages for us, lucky for us. As you can see from the kind of schematic matrix at the top left there, at Island Donald there's a very complicated sequence of phasing that was quite hard to pull apart, but basically lots of structures and complexity in the settlement going back a long way, arguably over 1,000 years, according to radiocarbon dates, and essentially a point that Mike's made in his PhD. It's lasting 1,000 years. Ian Armitt's arguing that it's seasonally flooded and that it probably wasn't permanently occupied, despite the kind of reconstruction aesthetic that we see up the top right there. It was occupied for 1,000 years. The pottery actually stayed remarkably similar. Ever since that site was found in the 1980s, and here's another series of quotes that I don't want you or need you to read all of, but basically it's just to make the point that once they'd found Island Donald or Loch Olivat, which is the loch on which it's found, everyone kept saying, oh, maybe more of these cranogs are Neolithic, as you can see there. So all the way from Anne Crone in 93 through to Mike in 2005 at the bottom there, people have been suggesting that many more await discovery, and there's been this idea that there might be more out there in the Outer Hebrides to be found. So people talked about Island Antia, which was dug in the 50s, dug in the 40s, published in the 50s, sorry, and don't worry too much about that site. It had a remarkable pottery assemblage. It was on an island now, but it's a much bigger island. It's not one of these small cranog-like islands, and whether or not it was an island originally in the Neolithic is a complicated matter that no one's fully resolved. So that often gets brought into the conversation, but I don't think it's a particularly similar kind of site, and Island Donald remains the only one really. People like Dixon and Topping have done surveys, and this one was carried out in the 80s. They weren't looking specifically for Neolithic sites, they were just interested in doing some underwater archaeology on islet sites, artificial islands, as you can see there. But they were frustrated in their efforts generally, actually, when you read that report, but also specifically in relation to no more Neolithic material culture emerged. So people kept thinking about whether or not there'd be Neolithic sites, and no one found them. Now, unfortunately, I was foolish enough not to give notice of my sound needs. So Chris Murray there is going to talk but you won't be able to hear him. I won't be able to do justice to Chris's voice, but I'll try and say what he's saying. So Chris lives in Stornoway. He's an ex-Royal Navy diver, and he is worked on search and rescue helicopters, and is generally quite a legend and a lovely man. Chris, being a curious character, was walking his dog one day. This is the story that he's telling, and he thought, oh, I wonder what that island over there is. That looks a bit odd. Being Chris, he didn't just leave it at wondering what it was. He thought, I know, and being an ex-Royal Navy diver, he got his scuba gear and actually went diving in the loch, as you do on a Sunday night across the bog. And thankfully for us, Chris found something very interesting. So there's a very evocative photo of Chris's hand with an Unstone bowl, a classic early Neolithic form, emerging out of the loch. Yeah, I think that wasn't quite the first one that he found. It'd be a bit too much to hope for that to be actually captured by the random person that was otherwise with him. But he's actually working with Mark Elliott, who worked at the museum in Stornoway, and that he showed the material that he found diving. Mark recognised it as Neolithic, and they put two and two together and became very interested in the fact that they had filled in this piece of the jigsaw that everyone had been waiting for, and the fact that maybe there were Neolithic crannogs. So you can see around these lochs there's almost complete pots and really amazingly preserved substantial sherds as well. I've never seen any Neolithic material culture like it really, and the preservation that you get in the bottom of the lochs is quite astounding, and you realise once you've dived at the bottom there that it's just that amazingly still environment. It doesn't feel particularly still up above the water, I tend to find in Lewis, but down below there's an amazingly still quality to that environment where it's been deposited, which is preserving the pot to a really beautiful extent. So Chris and Mark then, doing what good modern archaeologists do, went on Google Earth and basically looked for comparable sites, and then walked a long way across quite difficult terrain and dived those sites and found more sites that were producing equally impressive assemblages to that one that we saw from Loch Arnish just back there. So they'd really picked up on something. That ended up in Alison Sheridan at the National Museum in Scotland, in Edinburgh. Seeing the material, Chris ultimately, they reported it, and Alison had a look at it, and it's still housed at NMS. And our involvement came when Alison knew that, as Tim said at the beginning, Fraser and I had a project looking at the Western Seaways, and as part of that, we were radiocarbon dating all of the early Neolithic sites that we could find. And Alison knew that we were doing that. She'd been helping with various things that we were doing. And she said, oh, we've got this amazing pottery from some loch sites in Lewis. Looks early Neolithic. Can you date it? And we had some room to date it, so we did. So that's how we got, and that article in Past is what emerged, and you can see that lovely photo.
Did you say early Neolithic?
Yeah. So it's around, the dates are about, for this material, is about 3,700 to 3,000 basically.
Yeah, is that C14 dates?
Yeah. So we dated 3 of the sherds. We dated it on residue on the pottery, and I'll tell you in a minute. But some of the site that we dug this summer just gone, we got some really nice charcoal to date, but we haven't got the dates back or anything like that yet. But it's mainly, we know that mainly because of typological reasons rather than radiocarbon dating. That was where our involvement first came about, thanks to Alison involving us. And Fraser and I finished up on our previous project, the Stepping Stones project, and we kind of every now and again we talk on the phone and say we should go and have a look at those sites in Lewis, and especially given Fraser's skills of being able to dive to a very high standard and to be able to do underwater geophysics, he was the man for the job. I just happened to be there and be quite good at making the tea. So we got involved, and we were lucky enough to get some funding from the Honor Frost Foundation, to carry out. We went on a recce in 2015, and then we've subsequently had 2 seasons of field work in 2016 and 2017, as you can see up the top there. So I'll just give you a quick run through about what we've been up to. That's one of the sites, Loch Langfat, the one that you saw on Google Earth that Chris found in that through those means. And I'll just give you a little bit of a zoom towards that site. Lovely drone footage in that spectacular landscape. So you don't always have to fly to the island, we normally get a boat. And you can see what work, I like this footage because you can see Chris moving very manically because the video is speeded up, but you get a sense of the kind of thing that we've been doing. So divers in the water around the island undertaking further material culture discovery and also underwater photogrammetry, and you just get a sense of the stunning landscape that we're working. The sea, for anyone that knows Lewis, the sea and Dalmore Beach are just over that horizon there. Some of you might remember that dramatic scene of the oil rig having been beached on the shores of Lewis. It was being brought from Shetland to somewhere miles away, I can't remember where, and it was just over the hill there. So that's where we've been working. The picture that we had at the beginning of the lecture, and that you can see there, and there you can just about, I'm sure you can all make out nicely the causeway leading from the nearby shore to the island, and you might just be able to make out a couple of divers in the water there. So that's the other main site that we've been working on at Loch Borgestell. So there's a quick map of Lewis, so that's the top part of the Outer Hebrides obviously. And you can see hopefully 3 sites in black that we've been doing work on, and then the one in grey, so it's not quite as visible as it might be, Loch Anduna, is a site that Chris found substantial assemblages of Neolithic pottery at, but we haven't done any work on because we haven't really had time to. We've had 2-week seasons twice, so I think we've got, see what you think, but I think we've got quite a lot done in those 2 times 2 weeks, so it's a bit much to try and do 4 sites, so we cut things down to 3 the first year and 2 the second year. So these are some slides from Fraser. So that's the normal kind of, I don't know, maybe not normal, but that's the one environment that Fraser and his colleagues have been working on in the Black Sea, undertaking underwater survey of archaeological sites on a massive scientific vessel with state-of-the-art underwater ROVs and sonar and ships and a team of 60 helicopters. I like his big ship arrow, it's very helpful, isn't it? Up the top left there. And this is what we had to work with.
So what's the difference?
Yeah, exactly. And you can't completely see, but that GPS that's tied to the echo sounder there is genuinely attached to a broomstick handle that we bought in Wicks. As we had this immensely expensive piece of underwater geophysical equipment, but it's all built for going on big boats, and we had to get to a loch in the middle of nowhere, and with the biggest boat we could get there, which was that boat. And I can honestly say I've never before, and probably will never again, work on such a logistically challenging project as this. But it's all part of the fun. It's great fun, but it is incredibly logistically challenging. So we had a small boat and the geophysical equipment. Luckily Fraser knows what he's doing, so he thought long and hard, and we had many conversations in which I went, oh, I don't really know, Fraser, and then he'd just talk to me and work it out himself. But we came up with the right equipment for the job. We did surveying so what Felix and his snorkel there is plotting finds on the bottom of the loch with an extra long pole. We're doing it with a total station because we were a bit wary of dropping the £20,000 worth of GPS kit in the water, that kind of thing. But it all worked basically. And I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of some of the results. So what we were able to do with that geophysical equipment attached to the boat there, driving up and down, is get a sense of the bathymetry, so the underwater topography of the lochs. And you can see this is Arnish here. So it's draped over an aerial photo, obviously, of that landscape, and you can see the island there, and we've got a very deep section of underwater topography immediately adjacent to this kind of finger that comes out into the land. And that's true of all three of the sites that we looked at. So they clearly understand their underwater topography, and they're constructing these sites in accordance with that, often adjacent to particularly deep parts. And when you think about the process of construction, you can imagine that you might have chosen a relatively shallow bit, because they're basically taking stones out into the middle of the water and piling them up to make a big pile that they can then do whatever they do on. We'll come to that in a minute. We're also, because of the cleverness of the echo sounding equipment, we're able, one beam hits the surface and the next beam goes through to the solid geology, so you can actually get a sediment depth model that you can see in 2D there and kind of 3D up the top there. So we're actually, for future work, able to know how deep the sediment is at the bottom of different parts of the lochs, and that has implications for the kind of environmental evidence that we'll be able to build, the coring work, that kind of stuff. We also, at the same time, one of the two bits of kit on that boat was side scan sonar, and basically sonar, what it does is it just creates a kind of an image, a two-dimensional image, whereas that last stuff is three-dimensional. This is two-dimensional pictures that you can then drape over the top. But you can see, so that's the whole series of sweeps that we've done on the boat, and you can see when on this zoomed in one, that's the island, and you can actually make out individual boulders and things like that. So the resolution is incredible. It's more, it's better than your normal geophysics that you do on land, basically. And in theory, we could pick out individual ceramic vessels if we were lucky enough to do that. But thus far, we've really only picked them out by divers coming up with them in their hands. Which you can see there. So luckily, we're all slightly worried that Chris had basically got all the good stuff and we were going to turn up and be swimming around for 2 weeks finding nothing. The first site I haven't shown you some footage from, but it was incredibly bad visibility, and to be honest, Chris had warned us that it would be, because he knows what he's talking about. So that was a bit disappointing, but we had 3 sites to do, so we moved on quickly. So this is Langvath actually, but it could just be as well be some photos from Borgestale, and you can see these substantial vessels just sitting on the shore of the loch bed around the stone islets, basically, and I could show you many more similar photos, basically. So you can see what we're doing is we're marking them with pin flags, and then we lift the material out, and we then do that plotting using the total station and Felix holding the pole from the surface, basically. So it's a little bit of a complicated procedure, more complicated than normal, but some remarkable material culture. And there's just that site with the plots that we've produced of the material over the sonar image, and you just get a sense of the amount of stuff. They're not, I won't tell you that they're all just massive great sherds, like half a vessel, but they're pretty much all substantial sherds. So loads of it, particularly on that, of one side of that particular islet there. It gives you a sense of how we're able to record this stuff a bit more archaeologically than previously happened, but also the amounts of material that are there to be recovered. And we were back there this summer, and we weren't really meant to be lifting pots anymore, because we were meant to be focusing on dry land, but the divers sometimes just couldn't help themselves. They go, "Oh, Duncan, I found a really nice one, can I just bring it up?" And then, sure enough, it would be a fantastic plot along those lines. And again, we could just plot them, so it seems a shame to leave them down there. So amazing stuff. Just a bit of GoPro footage from the diving. If we had sound, you'd kind of hear kind of breathing through the scuba. You can imagine this whole thing. So on top of that amazing material culture, we've been finding, particularly on one site, Borgestale, timbers, and you can see in this case, so this is on the edge of the islands. You come just as the silts meet the bottom of the loch, and then you come up a bit further, and you can probably just make out the stones at the very top in the orange part of that image. So that's where it is in the crenel. And there's timbers embedded into the stratigraphy, basically, so you can see the horizontals particularly off the edge of that site. So we've got work timbers, and there's just a photogrammetric version of that, and you can see basically quite a few, they're now horizontal on the lock bed, so that's a vertical image looking down, as though you were kind of looking from the surface of the lock, and you can see that they're all flat like that, they're all work timbers, and we're not sure yet whether they were originally flat. We think probably they were not, that they might have been revetting the mound and they've subsequently fallen down flat. But definitely worked, and we took some samples this summer for dendro dating. You can't fit it into the dendrochronology sequence, unfortunately, because it doesn't go back that far, but we'll have a floating sequence that will also be able to radiocarbon date. So timber structural evidence, as well as the stone structure that you can very clearly see at the top of your picture there, and you've seen already in the footage. So that was what we uncovered in 2016. We were able to establish that basically these were the man-made sites using thousands of kilograms, tons really, of rocks, piling them up in the middle of the loch to create an artificial island in these cases. As you've just seen, there's some wooden architecture as well. On two of the sites, the one that we've subsequently gone back to, there's only Neolithic material culture. So we talked about the multi-phase nature of the sites previously, but on two of the sites we haven't got any later material, but it's got loads of Neolithic. So on those it seems as though they are only Neolithic sites, they haven't been reoccupied. On some they are reoccupied and we've got later stuff, but on two of the sites, the ones that I'm focusing on today, only Neolithic material culture. So that was really nice. So as a result of that, our funding ended, but we luckily we were able to convince people to give us a bit more money, and we were able to go back this summer. 2017. What the kind of work we did, I'll just run quickly through this, is photogrammetry, and one of the challenges amongst the many of working on these sites is the fact that you've got above water archaeology and you've got below water archaeology. So what we've been doing is, when I say we, I haven't really been doing it myself, but the divers have been, I wouldn't want to, I was too busy digging holes at the top like normal archaeology, but they were swimming for hours basically, taking thousands of photos, and able to put them into the photogrammetry software and stitch them all together into a three-dimensional model. And that's Fraser's quick first attempt, but you could, if you wanted, you could swivel it around and look at that site in 3 dimensions. And to give you a sense of what's going on there, the green in the middle is the stuff that's, it's kind of lucky, but that's the stuff above the water, and the blue is the stuff below water. So we've been able to build up under and above water through underwater photogrammetry and lots of photos taken from a drone above water, a 3-dimensional model of the whole site, which is a really nice thing to be able to do. So that was a lot of work actually to make that. You can probably tell from the way I talk about it. It was an awful lot of work to do the underwater photogrammetry, and it's really real pioneering stuff that, particularly at Southampton, they've been pioneering in various different ways. I should tell you probably that this is the one that worked best. The other site that we did, do you know what messed up the process? It was too sunny. Who would have thought that in the Isle of Lewis? So the ripples were coming, I know, it was amazing. It was shorts and t-shirt weather, apart from I hadn't brought any shorts. But the ripples were coming through the surface of the water and showing on the rocks beneath. And the photogrammetry software relies on pixel matching to put stitch photos together, and because the ripples were going across, it messed up the photogrammetry software's mind. And Fraser's confident that it will be fine in the end, but it wasn't working initially very well. And I find it quite amusing that it was because it was too sunny. Moving on to the second thing we did last summer, excavation. As I said, it's a logistically challenging project. Digging on a small little island in the middle of a loch with only a small boat to move anything with is definitely quite logistically challenging, I can tell you that now. So that's, our solution was to bring some of those big 1-ton aggregate bags, and lined them up, and the spoil went in them, so we could keep control of the spoil. You can see how full they are, so hopefully we'll get back at some point, and we're going to have to think of a slightly better solution, or buy some more bags or something like that, build a floating pontoon. But so sometimes it can be quite stressful, because there's no room to move, and there's nowhere to put the spoil, and you don't know whether it's going to be on top of the archaeology then, as ever. But in this case it's particularly acute, because there's not much apart from the archaeology to put your spoil on. But we got some good results. So switching to a vertical photo, you can see we ended up doing a trench across the middle, just straight across the middle, and then extending it out this way. And because hopefully you can see, it's not the clearest in this photo, but there's a kind of oval shaped structure that you might just be able to, I'm sure you can make out this sort of wall, sometimes in some places up to 5 courses high. And I'll zoom into a ground level shot just to show you that. So that's that feature excavated out. You can see quite high for Outer Hebridean Neolithic structures. On the left there, you've got reasonably decent standing walls, but it's actually a tiny little thing. That's a metre scale bar there, more of a shelter or a hut than a house, I think, not the kind of architecture that Ian Armit was getting at Island Donald. In that, I'm sorry I haven't got a photo for you today, but in there we had lots of burnt material that I was saying about that we'll be able to radiocarbon date, little thing, burnt patches that you might call hards in that, in the floors of that building, and then a limited amount of Neolithic pottery and quite a lot of work quartz. So it very much looks, we were worried that these might be later features, but there was no evidence to suggest it wasn't Neolithic. Not the kind of quantities of material you're getting in the loch bed, but nonetheless good quantities of material that make us confident that this is a little structure built on that island that was Neolithic in date. And there's my handy sketch, because we haven't turned the photogrammetry models into state-of-the-art sections yet. But interestingly, on that site, as you might have picked up on already, this site, Langevat, is built on a natural crag that's in the loch already. We kind of appreciated that diving last time. But you can probably see there, and actually there very clearly, that's the natural rock. So what they've done is they've focused on a little island. In Borgestell it's just a pile of stone. But here what they've made is they've made a big kind of ring donut around that island, and then they've built a flat floor across this bit here, and then a structure is built on top that perhaps they're sheltering in from whatever they're doing on this site. So the question I'm sure you're asking, or hopefully you're asking, is what are these islets all about? What's going on? What are these Neolithic crenels? And so I'll spend the rest of the talk trying to explain and answer that question. And to do that, I just want to take a step back away from these sites. And in a way, it's a tour through my own kind of intellectual development about what's going on. So research context number 1, the early Neolithic and the Outer Hebrides. Just a nice map from Whittle, Bayliss and Healy's Gathering Time. I'm sure probably many of you have seen that now kind of iconic map of the Mesolithic Neolithic, the early Neolithic spreading across Britain. And up there you can see, not well dated, question marks, but maybe around 3,700, the Neolithic arrives in the Outer Hebrides, northwestern Scotland and the Outer Hebrides, okay? Interestingly, in the case of the Outer Hebrides, there's very little Mesolithic archaeology, and Steph Piper, who did a PhD at Durham about that, Mike Church and various people from Durham have been working on Mesolithic sites in the Outer Hebrides. There's really interesting stuff emerging out of that work. So they found quite a lot of sites, but they're in very, very narrow pinprick areas of the Outer Hebrides. So we haven't got a lot of Mesolithic there. It's not like the inner Hebrides where lots has come about. But I don't know whether that's a real picture of the Mesolithic, or it's just that we haven't been looking in a sustained enough manner. And there might be many more Mesolithic sites out there to be found, but at the moment they haven't been found yet, and they're not clearly visible. When you get to the early Neolithic, there's quite a lot of sites, and as you can see from Island Dommel and our site that we dug in South Uist, there's substantial archaeology, there's substantial sites. There's quite a clear early Neolithic presence. And I think that one point you can take from that is that arguably, in this case, it is about people moving in from outside. It's not straightforwardly just the indigenous Mesolithic population taking on Neolithic ways. It could well be argued, given that discrepancy in population site size and density, that there is an incoming population. So bear that in mind. Then in terms of the second point to make about that scenario, that emerged out of our work at South Uist. You can see on that funny little island in between an island and the mainland of South Uist, which you can see in the background of that. Another beautiful day in the Outer Hebrides. It's not always like that. And while we were working on Andorlin, exciting monograph advert up the top there, similar, so as a subtle, not so subtle selling point. But our site in South Uist, I'm not going to tell you a lot about this site because it's about my realisation. So it's a nice archaeology, quite complicated phasing, Hebridean, Neolithic, early Neolithic and grooved wearing date. But so it was a bit trash because it was a tidal islet that had been eroded by the sea for forever. And so the archaeology that we had was fragmentary, but it wouldn't look out of place on lots of those other early Neolithic sites. But what did make the site stand out was the character of the pottery assemblage. You can see Dan excavating one of the vessels. That one on the bottom right is not characteristic. The images on the left, the drawn images, are much more characteristic of it was a very plain assemblage. It looks quite different. You can see up in that photo there on the top right. It looks quite different to the kind of pottery you've seen on the sites we've been looking at so far, but nonetheless it's the same date, basically. Another thing that made it stand out, we had 10,000 lithics, flint and quartz, some of which you can see there, which was, we never imagined we'd have that much, and we hadn't foreseen that at all, and I felt bad about that until I did a quick summary. So what I've done over the top of those sites, the early Neolithic sites, I've summarised the size of the flint assemblages from other major excavations across the Outer Hebrides from the Neolithic, and you can see that there's very, very little, so that's literally the totals, 34, 105, 1 from one site of flint. Down in Andorlin, 10,000, and out Crystal, right down the bottom there, 3,500. Now, undeniably, that's partly a result of geology and the availability of flint, which is more available down in the south, and quartz is more available up in the north. But the point to take home from that image is the fact that there's not material flow between the south and north. They could have exchanged that flint, and therefore they could have had more on those sites up in the north, which are contemporary, and let's be honest, not that far away, but that doesn't seem to be happening. And the other thing that's interesting, given that, is the character of the pottery assemblages, which I've already alluded to. So there you can see some nice images, those nice images again of mine from Island Dommel, just to give you a sense of some pottery from that site. But all of these sites, again in the north, are highly decorated and very variable in the forms and the decoration on the pots.
And at the same day?
Yeah, these are all basically that second half of the 4th millennium. And Island Dommel in our site goes right the way through that, and it's unchanging. And our site kind of fits in the middle of that sequence, but our site is completely plain. And in Out Crystal, it's not as plain as Andorlin at all, but it's plain relative to all of the other sites. So again, you just get that sense that there's not a uniform way of doing things. And then when you look at the character of the sites, so that's just a broad characterisation of the kind of sites they are, they're also very different. You're getting islet sites, sometimes just hard middens, large pits, upland houses, coastal houses, and the islands that we've been looking at already up in the north. So you're getting, even the kinds of site you're getting are very different to one another. And it makes you wonder whether people maybe who have come into this part of the world are new, afresh, and then it's playing out over centuries, but they're doing it in a way that all choosing to do things quite differently, and they're not exchanging flint between one another, and they're using different kinds of pottery assemblage. So in terms of what that tells us about how we can understand our islet settlements, just to return to that kind of core issue, I think perhaps how we need to understand them has been conditioned by our understanding of cranogs from much earlier on. And we could see them as settlements with a question mark, as I've added after that. And if we do choose to see them as settlements, like those later sites, we have quite a particular view of them. We went there probably thinking they probably were, a bit like Armit site, which does appear to be a settlement, albeit seasonally occupied perhaps. So a series of reconstructions through the ages, but very much sites that look like places where you live the whole year round, and you might talk about protection and that kind of stuff by living on an island. But then when you think about Langerbach, the site that we've excavated most significantly, you think about the character of that tiny little structure, the fact that there's actually a rock poking up through the floor of the island, and from the fact that there's tons of complete and substantially complete pottery vessels chucked all around those islands. You wonder whether that's straightforwardly settlement practice in a way. And it's a question that remains to be answered, still a question, but it makes you wonder. And I didn't wonder about that really until we did that excavation this summer, because it really transformed our understanding of the character of that site in particular. It'd be great to go back to Borgestone and find out more there as well, which hopefully we'll do in time. So I thought, you might want to choose to think about them not as settlements, to step away from that idea of these sites being settlements that we've kind of got a legacy of doing because of that long history of cranog research and conceptualisation of cranogs, and maybe it's actually more appropriate to think of them as monuments. And if you play a little game and you take some beautiful photos from Canmore of Bar Palangas, a tomb from North Europe, so just down the road, and you get a sense of the kind of stone architecture there and the kind of, I know it's modern day isolation, but you can see it sticking out in the landscape there, in the midst of a very broad sweep of landscape. And then you switch to the architecture of our sites, so big piles of stone, monumental piles of stone of quite similar dimensions actually to sites like Bar Palangas. And you think of water not straightforwardly as an isolating thing, isolating in some ways but not necessarily in all ways. You can make that comparison. So you step away from viewing them as settlements and think maybe that they're fulfilling a role more similar to monuments. I'm not saying they're doing the same thing as tombs, but maybe they should be seen in that ballpark rather than as settlements. You can think of them quite differently. So in terms of what that means, how changing the way you think about them has a knock-on effect. If you see them as settlements, you're talking about people being in social isolation. People often talk about making statements of their separate identity, which would work given that material patterning around the outer bridge that we talked about. People seem to be separating themselves off from other people, and you might want to think about it as a time of trouble at that broad scale, which might be what you would infer from the disjunction of the material and the different kinds of ways of living at the same time. But if you choose to see them as more monumental, it's still isolated, but it's an isolation of practice. That causeway is separating you from the mainland, but maybe it takes you to a special place, much like a tomb might have been a special place in itself. You don't have to see it as a statement of separation and making your own identity that you wanted boundaries around. It might be a communal process, much like monuments have come to be seen as communal endeavours that the whole community got together to build. So maybe it is a statement of communal identity at that relatively local scale anyway. You're separate from society, but you're maybe only separate for quite a short period, and it's an intentional separation for doing things that are separate from normal life. So you might argue that it's actually a time of togetherness, at least at that relatively local level. And these maybe monumental sites are playing a role that enables people to feel together and to have an established identity and a common task. So just some kind of enigmatic thoughts and maybe questions to find out what you think, because they're still difficult sites to interpret, and we're just working through these questions as we go. There's lots more questions to answer, and with a bit of luck we'll get some more funding to not just to look at these sites in more detail, but also to try and find out across the Outer Hebrides how many of those, that real density of cranogs that cavers and many others have picked up on, might also be Neolithic. I'm not sure if we'll be able to persuade Chris to go and dive across 150 cranogs in the Outer Hebrides, but I'll give it a go. If Chris won't do it, we might have to. So on that note, I'd just like to say thank you to you, thank you to our funders and the Western Isles Council, especially Kevin Murphy, who's been extremely supportive of our work. All those people that have funded our work so far, including the Antics, in whose building we're here tonight. So thank you for listening, and thank you to our funders, and thanks very much.